what would you consider to be your greatest professional accomplishment?
Oh, goodness. It's hard to, it's like saying, what's your favorite child, right? I mean, the 41 years with the Rolling Stones is certainly something I'm very, very proud of. I'm very fortunate to have a Lifetime Achievement Grammy from my years with the Allman Brothers Band. That's pretty special. But at the same time, I'm very proud and happy to be one of only 4 people to have been given an honorary ranger moniker from the U.S. Forest Service. That's pretty special to me, very, very special to me. But also the opportunities to work with these other artists I mentioned. David Gilmour, brilliant guy. Eric Clapton I worked with for 2.5 years, 2 records with John Mayer. Just been very fortunate to work with all these different artists. And that's been the joy of my career, to have been able to work with all these brilliant people and be a part of it. That's the crowning achievement, I guess.
This is the Mass Timber Group Show. I'm Nick.
And I'm Brady, and we talk about building sustainably. On today's episode, we interview a world-renowned rock star who's a National Outstanding Tree Farmer of the Year, Mr. Chuck Leavell. Chuck's got over 40 years of music experience playing with musical legends like Eric Clapton, the Rolling Stones, John Mayer, the Black Crowes, George Harrison, the Allman Brothers Band, and so many more. He's won a Lifetime Achievement Grammy Award, and he's one of only 4 honorary United States Forest Service Rangers to have ever been named. He's authored 4 books, and he and his wife, Rosalane, have won multiple awards recognizing their efforts in the forestry and tree farming business, including the 1999 National Outstanding Tree Farmers of the Year. He's been on numerous boards, including the American Forest Foundation and the United States Endowment for Forestry. He's the host of PBS's America's Forest with Chuck Leavell, and recently he won the Southeastern Regional Emmy Award for his work on A Night of Georgia Music. It's an absolutely incredible episode, and I can't wait for you guys to hear it.
It was one of my favorite episodes so far. We went over how he has about 4,000 acres that he tends to in Georgia on his tree farm. We go into CLT. We talk about what is CLT. We talk about how you need to get out there, plant some trees. He's currently working on a new season with America's Forest with Chuck Leavell. So hang on to your seats with this one.
It's going to be a great episode. We really hope you guys enjoy it. Please, if you love listening to topics on conservation, forestry, and hearing rock stars talk about all about them, please hit that subscribe button. And with that, let's get into it. One of the big things that we wanted to talk about is how your 2 different worlds came together. So you're a rock star on one hand and a tree farmer on the other. Can you tell us how those 2 worlds came together?
Well, first of all, great to be with both of you, Nick and Brady. I appreciate the invitation. Well, of course, music came first for me. Without going way deep, I can tell you that I learned initially from my mother. Mom was not a teacher or a professional, but when I was very young, oftentimes it was just the 2 of us in the house with my father out working and my older siblings in school. So when I'm 5, 6 years old, me and Mom in the house, and I'd tug on her skirt, Mama, play the piano for me. She was not, again, a professional or a teacher, but she could play. And I just loved watching her play. I was fascinated watching her hands go up and down the keyboard. And she would show me very simple things, sometimes leave me to my own resource. Chuck, I've got to go do my housework, but you stay here on the stool and work on something I've shown you, or make something up. It doesn't matter. Just have fun, So music has always been a pleasurable engagement for me. And as time went on, I learned more and more through the good graces of others that would share things with me. I never really took formal lessons. Being a child of the 60s, there was a period of time, especially getting into the 70s, when we had the problems of emissions. Car emissions were not what they are regulated today. Certain factories and industries were not regulated like they are today. So during that period of time, by the way, in Tuscaloosa, we had a paper mill there, and you could smell that thing from dawn to dusk. So there was concern about environmental subject matter when I was in my teenage years and whatnot, just because everyone was talking about it, quite frankly. And as we know, what was it, 72, when the EPA came into play. But my real passion didn't occur until I like to joke that it's all my wife's fault. Uh, Rose Lane comes from a family that have been dedicated and good stewards of the land for generations, farmers tending forest land, tending cattle and other livestock. So when we started dating, which by the way was 50 years ago, we're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. Um,
Congrats.
Thank you. Thank you. And I began to spend time with that family, and I began to sense and feel the love of the land that they had. And it began to, affect me. And I eventually kind of get into my own blood. And then to fast forward to 1981, her grandmother passed away. Her father had already passed away. And so she inherited about 1,000 acres of land. And this became a responsibility. We knew we wanted to keep it, but I wasn't certain what we should do with it. And we investigated all kinds of options, peach trees, pecan trees. We're in Georgia, so those were possibilities. Nursery stock came into play, and I went to the library and checked out books on land use and whatnot. But eventually there was a connection for me with forestry. First of all, where does that marvelous instrument that's given me such joy and such a great career come from? Where does most musical instruments come from, the resource of wood? And so there was kind of a personal feeling of, wow, a forestry, long-term sustainable forestry. Plus the fact is that, I realized row cropping, cattle farming, those other activities I mentioned were going to be a lot of day to day unless I hired a manager. And so forestry seemed like something that would be long-term. It would not require so much day to day. There was the personal connection. I started realizing all the incredible things that trees and forests do for all of us. And so I began to study forestry, and that's how that came about.
So it's still full time. I mean, is this, you have a lot of different passions, and music obviously is one of them, still traveling and rolling around with the Rolling Stones. But, we just kind of talked about how much acreage you have, and it was totaling about 4,000 acres that you tend to.
That's correct. Yes. Not all contiguous, about 2,800 contiguous. And then there's several outlying tracts that are not all that far away, but nevertheless not directly connected to the main part of our place.
So what takes up the most time? I'm curious for, I know you love, doing fire breaks and kind of burning and whatnot, but I got to say that's a ton of acreage to tend to.
Well, it depends on the time of year, really. And, this year we'll be doing a little bit of harvesting on the place. Hard to say exactly how much acreage we will be thinning, but it will probably be around 150, 200 acres. So we're preparing for that. You do the burns in the cold weather times, and certainly a little bit into spring, but you don't want to do it past about April. So those activities were done back in the cold months through about April. Once everything starts growing back vigorously, we've been fortunate to have a lot of rain this season, so everything looks great, very green and beautiful. We have a lot of network of roads, and so we have to keep up those roads. There might be activities such as pruning to go down, pruning lower limbs of trees here and there that might need it. I mentioned spraying in my longleaf field. We have several longleaf plantations, I guess you would say, on the place, but this one particular area is about 6 years old now, so it's getting close to the age where you can start raking pine straw on it. And so down at the base of the trees, I've been spraying glyphosate to get rid of the weeds and any other woody growth or whatever that's growing right up next to the trunks of the trees, and then mowing in between the rows. And, it'll be another couple of years before I can really start raking pine straw, but that's a pretty good activity that we can do. The pine straw, by the way, is used in landscaping for country clubs, residential areas, office parks and that kind of thing. So that's another activity. Hey, just keeping the grounds maintained. We have a lodge for our hunting guests. Actually, we have, I think, 4 different facilities where we have them stay with us. And so there's a lot of grounds just to keep mowed and pretty. And so, there's a lot to do. My wife says I've got job security because I'll never get it all done.
Tree Man, which is a documentary, I hope everyone can go out there and check it out. It's a super cool documentary that encapsulates your whole life, your rock star life. But then, there's a common thread, which you're, a man of forestry. And there was a part about that you were kind of tackling some beetles out there, right? What do you kind of have to do to make sure that doesn't take over?
Well, again, that's a very regional sort of thing. It depends on what insects may come into play for any particular type of forest. Here in the Southeast, there's 3 insects that we focus on. One is called the Ips beetle, IPS, Ips. The other is the black gum turpentine beetle, and then there's the dreaded southern pine beetle. The southern pine beetle, if it gets going, and you have, for instance, a drought going on and the trees might be stressed out, those guys can, if they really hit hard, they can eat up, almost an acre a day.
Yeah.
So I think in the film, what you saw was an area of Ips beetles. However, it was in a drought at the time, and they had spread pretty widely. So I think the total acreage was about 20 acres that we had to clear cut. And I decided not to replant it. That's not a huge area in terms of what we do and what we have. So I decided to leave it kind of natural. And what I've been doing, which has been kind of fun, is going in now that growth is coming back, all kinds of growth, all kinds of different trees are coming in, weeds, grasses, legumes and whatnot. I've been going through with a mower and picking out the trees that I think are the sturdiest and the biggest and that have the best chance of survival, and leaving those and mowing around everything else. And so then once that's sort of established, I can come in with some spray if I need to regulate what the future will be in that area. So, it's a sad thing to have the beetles on there, but it also gives you an opportunity to do something a little different.
You talk a lot about the different uses that you have at Charlane, from, mature timber harvesting to pine straw to hunting. In your first book, you talk a lot about managing forests for different use. How have kind of changes in the past evolved into what they are today, and what are the contrasts there?
Well, thanks for mentioning the book, Forever Green, The History and Hope of the American Forest. Look, in my travels and when I talk to some people, oh man, you grow trees. That's fantastic. But I worry so much about what's happening with our trees and forests. Well, what do you mean? Well, I've seen these clear cuts and they're just murdering the trees. They're killing the trees, and a lot of people have a misconception of the practice of forestry. Yes, there was a time in America's history when we did rape and pillage. But that time was in the 1800s, somewhere around the late 1800s, early 1900s. There came a word called conservation into play, and you had characters like Gifford Pinchot, Theodore Roosevelt, Carl Schenck. There was a guy named Bernard Fernau who was also, I think he was Polish, but he had studied forestry in Europe and brought concepts to America. And so we began to manage our forest lands. We began to conserve the forest lands. And so the point to people is, you're going to have some clear cuts. Look, everything has a mortality. Everything that lives has a mortality. And so if you're going to use the product, let me say this, certainly you want to preserve areas for aesthetic value, old growth forests and the redwood forests in California and the Pacific Northwest. National forests that we have, national parks, places that people want to camp and recreate. But we also need areas that we can grow timber for eventual harvest. Through the years, you're going to thin a little bit, and then at some point, a clear cut is not necessarily a bad thing. You're going to do a final harvest, and then you're going to go in and site prep and plant a brand new forest. That's kind of the way that we work it. Now, me as an individual that's going to have a completely different outlook and a completely different cycle than, say, a timber company. If you're International Paper, your Weyerhaeuser or Green Diamond or others, they're in the business of growing trees for financial gain. There's certainly managed well these days. They have really talented foresters that are very passionate about what they do on their teams, but they want to grow it as fast as possible for revenue purposes. In some cases, they own the mills as well. So, they want to feed their mills with the products. But again, all of these companies these days have a strong ethic. They have a passion for what they do, like I do. But getting back to the point, their cycle here in the Southeast, you can grow saw timber if you have good soil, good rain, good genetics in the trees, and you plant seedlings today that are this big. In maybe 30 to 35 years, you might be getting saw timber out of it. So that would be something that a timber company might consider in their cycle. For me, I'm interested in enjoying the property. I'm interested in riding my horses through it. I'm interested in hunting it. I'm interested in walking my dogs through it and taking Rosalane and I. And so our cycle is more like 60 years, 70 years. A healthy loblolly pine will probably live to be maybe 100 years old, but somewhere around, 80, they start declining. And as I said, everything has a mortality. So our cycle is more like a 60, 70, 80 year cycle.
You have such a broad scope of experience and depth on forests, and you share a lot of that on your PBS series, America's Forest with Chuck Leavell. What's new and exciting in there? I know you guys are putting together a new series. Can you tell us more about that?
Thanks for mentioning. Yes, this has been a wonderful journey for me. I've always wanted to advocate for sustainable forestry and for sound forest management. I've done it through the books that you've mentioned. I've done it through speeches here and there, presentations, doing field days here at Charlane. But I've always felt that the best way to reach people would be through a television program. And so we have really enjoyed this journey. My partner, Bruce Ward, and I have been doing this for close to 10 years now, which is crazy. We're about to shoot our 12th and 13th episodes in Maine, which we look forward to. That will constitute a series. So if we want to package together a series of America's Forest, then we can do that. Program currently is a 30-minute program, and we've been doing it state by state. So every program has a state theme. We've done programs in California. We've done them here in Georgia. We've done South Carolina. We've done Wisconsin, and so forth. But we want to change that going forward. We want to go from a 30-minute to a 1-hour program to give us more time to go in depth, and also to change from state to state to a thematic series, so that we would, say, have an episode on climate change, maybe an episode on, as we talked about earlier, disease and insects in certain forests. You could do an episode on wildlife or episodes, plural, on different types of wildlife, because as we know, in the different parts of the country, you're going to have different species. Perhaps an episode on some of the wonderful work being done with universities that have forestry programs. Auburn, Alabama has a great one. University of Georgia has a great one. Duke University. Then, of course, in the Pacific Northwest, you have programs that are more dedicated to those species out there. So that's what we're trying to evolve into.
There was, on your first season, there was a CLT plant that you went and checked out, wasn't there?
Yeah, the very first program we did was in Portland, Oregon, and we went to Albina Yard, which is a very early in the U.S. effort to build a mass timber building, and they have completed that, and it looks great. And the architect was a gentleman named Thomas Robinson. And so we looked at his offices and his designs, very brilliant. And then we also went to a mill, the D.R. Johnson mill, that was one of the first mills that was producing CLT. And for any of your viewers and listeners that don't understand what CLT is, cross-laminated timber, and there's a sister product called glulam. The CLT is a process of taking layered boards of lumber side by side, and then coming on top of that in a perpendicular fashion side by side, and then again. And depending on what your goal is, you may have 7 or so layers. This creates a massively strong wall, if you will. And then there's laser technology, so that once you design a building and you do this process and you wound up with this wall, then you can cut out the windows, cut out the doors, and put it on a big truck and truck it out to the site, and literally just lift this thing up, and there's wall number 1. And you do this throughout the process, and you're able to build tall buildings with this process, depending on how much you're layering and the design of the building. But, I think we're looking at now buildings that might be as tall as 20, 25 stories. The ones that exist now are certainly at least up to 12, 13 stories. This has been done in Europe for quite a long time, in Japan for quite a long time. It's relatively new in the States, but it's catching on. And, when you think about the options of building, look, there's no material that is more organic, natural, and renewable than that of wood. And by the way, that wood, even though it's cut into lumber and putting into a building, is still sequestering carbon. It's
Right.
still holding that carbon inside those walls. Look at the concrete and steel. First of all, they create a lot more pollution to make. They certainly do not sequester carbon. And on an aesthetic plane, they just don't give you that beautiful natural feel that you get when you see the grain of the wood in the wall. So I think you're going to see this coming more and more in architecture, even in communities that might be, planned communities kind of thing. And I think it's a very good process.
Yeah. Well, thank you for describing that. I know a lot of people, this is half the battle, is getting to educate people on what mass timber is and why it's a better form of construction. That was super cool that you mentioned Thomas Robinson, the founder of Lever Architecture. So we just got the green light today. We're going to have him on the podcast here in a couple months.
Oh, great. Great.
Yeah.
He's
So we're
a
looking.
fine gentleman and very knowledgeable about the subject.
He is.
Yeah.
He's on the forefront of mass timber design. Real quick, because there's going to be about a couple thousand people that shoot me if we don't talk a little bit about your rock star roles and whatnot. And we'll circle back to forestry and timber here in a second. But me and Brady, we remember when you came out with the Rolling Stones to Missoula, Montana.
Oh, yeah.
The entire city could hear you blasting from the university stadium. It was flat out incredible. So what can you tell us? Like, are you still touring? I mean, what do you got going on with the Rolling Stones these days? You got any surprises up your sleeve for 2023, 2024?
Well, I can tell you that there was a tour planned for 23, but the guys decided to postpone that. I think it will happen next year. There's 3 Rolling Stones these days. God bless Charlie. We lost Charlie Watts 2 or 3 years ago, and it still hurts that he's not with us. But of course, Mick and Keith and Ronnie are the principal members of the Rolling Stones, and they make the decisions of whether they're going to tour or not, or what's going to happen with the band. But it's been incredible for me to work with the guys for 41 years now, so I feel like I'm a fair part of the team, and I love what I do with those guys. Of course, I've also been blessed to work with a lot of different artists as well. But 41 years is a long time to keep a team together. So it's been a great joy. There'll be a new record coming out in September. I think
Nice.
probably they'll want to tour in 23. You probably know that we have toured almost every year with the exception of 2020, which was a lockdown year for just about everybody in the entertainment business. But in 21, we toured the States. In 22, we toured Europe. And so the guys remain active. I still love what we do, and they still love doing it. And so we'll see.
That's epic. We're looking forward to the new album.
Yeah, you talked a lot about playing with different artists, and in your documentary, I think John Mayer was in there, and it showed you playing with a couple different big country names in the business. What's been kind of one of your favorite experiences to play with more recently outside of the Stones?
Well, very recently, I was asked to be musical director for a segment on CMT on their awards ceremony, and the segment was a tribute to Leonard Skinner. And so
wow.
we had an all-star lineup. We had Slash on guitar, Billy Gibbons from ZZ Top on guitar, and my good friend Warren Haynes. We had Paul Rogers, the great Paul Rogers, singing. We had a great rhythm section. The background singers were the female background singers were Leanne Rimes and Winona.
Wow.
So that was pretty cool. And we did a little tribute to Leonard Skinner's section for the program. And in addition to that, I was invited by my old friends, the Black Crowes, since they were also on the program, to play on a segment with them. She Talks to Angels was the song that we did, which I had the pleasure of playing on their debut album a long time back. And the night before all this went down, CMT has a separate program called Crossroads, and the Black Crowes were the principal band to play on that show. And so they invited me to play with them. So that was a lot of fun. And that was very recently, only in the last 5 weeks or so.
That's awesome. Well, sweet, man. We're going to have to keep you on the radar. It's like you never stopped, right? I mean, is that mostly full time, or, I mean, what do you divide forestry? I mean, what would you say, half, or does one take over to the other?
Well, in the old days with the Stones, we would tour heavily. I remember in 89 and 90 during the Steel Wheels tour, I think we did something like 136 shows in a 18-month period. We don't do that anymore. That was then, this is now. So the new paradigm is more like 3-month period, 3 weeks of rehearsal, maybe 3.5 weeks of rehearsal, get everybody in shape. It's like going to spring training and of course, look, if we don't know how to play Jumpin' Jack Flash by now, there's a problem. But it's just muscle. You want to get the muscles, the fingers, the dexterity, and just get everybody back in the groove together. So there's about 3.5 weeks of rehearsal, and then maybe 15 or so shows that are kind of spread out with 2 to 3 days off in between shows. So, that's a lot different from the old days. That whole thing would be about 3 months long. And that suits me great in this phase of my life. It gives me time to do work here. Of course, during our hunting season, we run a commercial quail hunting operation at Charlane. That goes from November until mid-March. And thankfully, the guys always want to tour in the spring and summer. So that gives me, the time to do what I like to do here during the hunting season. But, it's not exclusively Stones. As I mentioned, these other projects can come up, and they're not going to take that long. I do personal appearances that might require 2 days, 3 days for me to be away and go play a show or give a speech or, we have this program. Thank you for mentioning the documentary, The Tree Man. The entire documentary is about 90 minutes, but I have a 30-minute edited version that I can show on a personal appearance, and then come out with a moderator with some scripted questions that allow me to tell stories and play certain songs. And that program can last, 90 minutes or so. So, those are short little blips that I can go out and do, come back home, be with my wife, with Rosie, work on the place. And then if the Stones do want to go out, I'm there with them, and if the phone rings and it's somebody interesting else that might invite me to do a recording session or to do a short tour. Yeah.
For people maybe just starting out in the musical world, maybe they want to be a rock star, maybe they just want to play some side gigs, but I know that you, in the Tree Man, the documentary, you mentioned your dad. One of your favorite quotes for your dad is, "You make your own luck." And I also remember that in the beginning, when you were trying to get your start, did you not sit out on the porch for just for days, I guess, on end, until the recording studio said, "Hey, we'll finally let you play on a track"? And what kind of advice would you give somebody starting out? Just show up and keep showing up until you're booked, and then, and that's it's hard work and nothing else. But what could you tell them?
Well, first of all, we live in a completely different age of music now with digital technology. That didn't exist when I came up in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Maybe it kicked in a little bit in the 80s and then from then on. But the point I will make is try to learn an instrument. It's great to have all that technology through computers and drum machines and whatnot. And there is an art to using those things. But from my point of view, I think you need to learn your instrument. And that takes hours of practice. There's no other substitute other than sitting behind that instrument and playing for hours on end, and learning the ins and outs of whatever instrument it might be. So I think that's number one. Number two, if you have the passion for it, and it does take passion, because, you're going to hit some brick walls and you're going to have some failures. You got to be willing to overcome those failures, or get through them anyway, to keep moving. And just, the old saying, never give up, never give up. And then the statement about making your own luck, I think in part that has to, in a way, I think I mentioned to you guys when we were planning this about the 5 Ps. The 5 Ps are proper preparation prevents poor performance. So if you're adept at your instrument, you've done the homework, you're confident, then you're going to be making your own luck. And the other side of that, I think, is learning how to be in the right place at the right time. When I was coming up, you mentioned there was a famous studio in Muscle Shoals. Actually, there were several famous studios in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. One in particular was called Muscle Shoals Sound. And I had a contact there, and it was a very small studio, so there wasn't a lot of room for people to hang out. But I knew an engineer there, and I would literally wait in the parking lot or sit on the porch, as you mentioned, and wait for whoever the session was to take a break, and the door would open. People would mingle out. I could go inside and meet my friend, and maybe I'd get a chance to sit down and play something and get somebody to hear me, hopefully. But, I've never been aggressive in that way. But, gently letting people know that I'm around and what I do. And then if they invite me to sit in or do something, that's an opportunity. So that's kind of what I mean about making your own luck.
I like it.
That's that persistence piece you're talking about, right?
I was just going to recount some times in my career where in this, you've seen it in the documentary, but in particular, when my band Sea Level broke up, which was a band that I had together for about 5 years, from 76 through about 80, the phone wasn't ringing for recording sessions. I had a little trio that I was playing in clubs, but I had been knocked down several notches, and it was frustrating, and I was not all that happy with it. But within a reasonably short period of time, I got a call from the Rolling Stones. So that worked out. But, the point being that you're going to have ups and downs. You're going to have the ebbs and flows in any career. I don't care if it's music or anything else. But don't be too frustrated with the downtimes, because sooner or later, there's going to be an opportunity.
Pushing through those downtimes. So the first time that you got a call from the Stones, you didn't end up getting the gig and you had to wait a few months for that call back. Can you walk us through kind of your mindset at that time and how you pushed through to end up being in the preparation and the time to actually pick up the call when it did ring again?
Well, when the call came, my wife took the call and she said, "Hey, guess what? The Rolling Stones called you today." And I said, "Honey, I don't need you to joke about these things now. Come on." She said, "Chuck, I'm serious. They called you today." And I said, "Why? Really? Here's the number. Go to the phone." And I did. And within 36 hours, I was on a plane for an audition. The original invitation was to audition for 1 day. Well, they kept me there for 3 days. That was a good sign. I felt like I fit with the guys. Everything felt positive. I get home and the phone doesn't ring and it doesn't ring. And so it maybe a week goes by, and finally Ian Stewart, who was a confidant of the band and a great piano player himself, called me, and we had made friends with each other during the process. And basically he said, "Chuck, the guys really loved what you do, but the tour is imminent. It's going to start very, very soon. And they feel safer keeping Ian McLagan, who had played keyboards in the Faces with Ronnie Wood. So there was also a friendship element to it. And Ian McLagan had also done the previous tour with the Stones. So they felt a little safer going out with him. Naturally, I was frustrated. I was disappointed. It was a big blow. But I understood and I got over it, and okay, well, let me go on about my merry way and do what I can do. And this was 1981, and they toured the States for about, probably 4 months. And at the end of that tour, they took a break. They all went home for holidays and whatnot. And not long after the first of the year in 82, I get a call from Ian Stewart saying, "We're going to tour Europe, and the guys have decided they want you." So there was a happy ending.
Earlier in the conversation, you mentioned a few key people in the conservation movement: Teddy Roosevelt, John Muir, Mr. Pinchot, people that kind of stepped in when the time was needed to talk about conservation and that relatively new concept.
Yeah.
Who are some of those people that you think are picking up the mantle for the related changes in our world today?
Well, in the world of environmentalism, let's forget about forestry for a minute, because it's all related. But I think David Attenborough is a genius. David Suzuki is another person that has lived a life of science and ecology, wildlife, the big picture of how it all fits together. Those guys, I think, are true heroes. And of course, Attenborough is still with us, and the Suzuki. And I love watching those programs on BBC with Attenborough. He's just such a good narrator, and he's so knowledgeable. So if you're looking at the big picture, I think those guys. If you're looking at forestry, I think it's the deans and the professors in these wonderful educational institutions that are teaching forestry. To me, they're the heroes. They're passing this information on to the next generation. It worries me a little bit that there's not as much field study in those educational programs these days. Everything's on the computer and you do the mapping. And of course, it's great. The technology is brilliant and very useful. But there's no substitute for getting out in the woods, whether it's a hot day and you're swatting the bugs, but you're in there and you're looking at the trees one-on-one in the forest, and you're looking it up and down, and you're seeing any problems that might exist. You look around you and you see, tracks of different animals. What's happening with that? Is there a lot of competition? Is there a disease problem here and there? Do you see any signs of insects? What's the weather been like? There's no substitute for being in that field, as far as I'm concerned, if you're going to be a true forester. Nevertheless, I think those that are experienced in these institutions and passing that information on to the next generation, those are my heroes of today.
Sorry about the technical difficulty. We just had a massive lightning strike and put me down. It blocked out my internet, and it's raining cats and dogs out here. So, anyways, I don't know what question you left off on, Brady, but you can take it away and we'll just keep going.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I hope the lightning didn't hit that tree right next to your house there.
We're good. It scared me out of my boots. I'm not kidding. It was like I was back in Baghdad.
I can imagine. So, but speaking of, as long as we're talking about weather events, that's certainly a challenge that we all have. I mean, heavens, we talked about the wildfires in California. One thing we didn't really talk about so much was, and by the way, the California episode that we did, we tried to focus on what's being done to prevent those wildfires. And let's face it, California and the Pacific Northwest is a heavily regulated area of the United States. And to get things done require a lot of permitting and this and that and the other. My feeling and what I saw was a lot of the people involved in forestry were trying to get the communities comfortable with prescribed burns, which helps to reduce that load of fuel on the ground. Another thing we saw that Governor Newsom had given his blessing for, and I thought was very smart and important, was on certain highways, on either side of the highway, they had machinery, I call them mulching machines, that grind the debris down to the ground, other than the trees that you want to have left for beauty or aesthetic purposes. But as far as the fuel on either side of that highway, they were getting rid of that with these machines for about 150, 200 feet on either side, so that if a cigarette goes out or a spark happens and a fire does start, it doesn't just go boom and travel so quickly. So it gives CAL FIRE an opportunity to go out there and put it out before it becomes a catastrophic wildfire. So the point is, things are being done in the Pacific Northwest to try to reduce those wildfires, but I would like personally to see more and more things done. Prescribed fire is certainly a part of what I think could be useful out there. You got to have the funding, you got to have the manpower to do these things, to prevent, not just to fight the fires when they happen, but to do the activities that can prevent them. So, it's important that people understand that and understand that there are methods that can be done to help prevent these catastrophic wildfires. Now, when it comes to other events, storms, hurricanes, we're seeing more and more of that. I think we can all agree. And that's a tough one. That's Mother Nature. And if she decides she wants to rip up something, she's going to rip it up. I'm one that actually believes that climate change is a reality and that we need to be doing things to slow this thing down. And hopefully, politically and practically, we will be doing those in the coming years and decades.
Nick, nobody can hear you, buddy. Think you're on mute.
Nick, I had the great pleasure of playing with David Gilmour of Pink Floyd on a tour, and their famous song was Comfortably Numb. And the line is, your lips move, but I can't hear what you're saying. So I see your lips move, but I can't hear you, Nick. I don't know what's up. Maybe the lightning blew your audio there.
It did. Well, I came back on, but no, it was in the end, just everyone plant one tree, and we'll take care of this whole global warming thing with carbon sequestration.
Nick, I'm so glad you brought that up because I would like to let your viewers and listeners know about a couple of organizations. One is there's I think, a brilliant concept. It's not really taking off as I would like to see it, but it's called One Ticket, One Tree. That pretty much speaks for itself. And by the way, the ticket doesn't have to be a ticket to a rock concert. It could be a ticket on an airplane. It could be a ticket on a train. It could be any kind of ticket to a sporting event. But if promoters, sports teams, rock bands would be able to say, okay, we're going to take, I don't know what the figure would be, but let's just say it's $1. you pay $350, $400, $500 for these tickets. And, if you take $1, $2 and put it to an organization that has the wherewithal to plant trees and that has the wherewithal to find the places to plant the trees, wow, think about what we could do. So I like this organization. If you Google it, it's the number one, the word ticket, and the number one, the word tree. One ticket, one tree. There's also a great organization started by Olivia Newton-John, of all people, God rest her soul, many years ago, called One Tree Per Child. And I think that's a beautiful concept. And you can work with school systems and educators to say, hey, let's plant some trees in our school area, or let's take the kids on a field day and let them all plant a tree. But if we could think about that, I think that would be a beautiful way to help put more trees in the ground.
Thanks for mentioning that. I know we're coming up on time, so we can finish it out with a little bit more rapid fire questions.
Sure.
How about so your favorite source of education and learning? I mean, if you could point people to maybe, book, podcast, show, movie, documentary, or something that kind of helped shaped you musically. And then even, if that dovetails into forestry as well.
How about Nick and Brady's podcast? Number one on the list.
Thank you for the shout out.
We'll clip that and share it everywhere.
Well, look, the internet is an incredible source, and you can go there and there's a plethora of organizations to investigate. But if you want me to name some, I'm happy to do so. The American Forest Foundation is a great organization. They run what's known as the American Tree Farm System, which is a network of landowners, forest landowners that look after their tree farms. If one has some property and wants to engage in information and a community of people, then the American Tree Farm System is a great way to do that. There's another organization called the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities. That's a long name. It's usually referred to as the endowment, but they do great work in finding ways to engage communities with things that are of interest for forests and trees. Hey, the good old Arbor Day Foundation is a great source. I think it's always tell people to look locally, to try to, again, your nearby school, your churches, offices, maybe, some people that live in communities. And let me just mention this. In my book, Growing a Better America, I looked at several communities that were eco-friendly, if you will. One was in Atlanta the Atlanta area, I should say, called Serenbe, Serenbes. The idea is the combination of the word serenity and the word bee. And this gentleman named Steve Nygren came up with this concept of an entire community using eco-friendly house building, wooden houses, yards that don't require so much maintenance and therefore not so much water, community garden, community activities, retail spaces where you can walk from your home to stores and little grocery stores and that kind of thing. That's a much better way than seeing, these shopping strips that get built and then 10 years later they're abandoned and they're sitting there with nothing to do. I like to think about smart growth. And so just, I would tell people that in your own community, pay attention to these things, pay attention to the possibilities and the planning and zoning boards that exist, and try to prevent rampant growth that doesn't mean anything, but promote growth that's smart, strong, and sustainable.
Beautiful. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Our local community is actually going through that entire process right now with neighborhood plans and our code reforms coming up. It's a really big deal, and it's something that citizens can definitely take a direct part in. Our next question, we usually ask, who inspires you? But you actually already answered that question, so I'm going to sub one in. What would you consider to be your greatest professional accomplishment?
Oh, goodness. It's hard it's like saying, what's your favorite child, right? I mean, the 41 years with the Rolling Stones is certainly something I'm very, very proud of. But equally, I'm very fortunate to have a lifetime achievement Grammy, from my years with the Allman Brothers Band. That's pretty special. But at the same time, I'm very proud and happy to be one of only 4 people to have been given an honorary, Ranger, moniker from the U.S. Forest Service. That's pretty special to me, very, very special to me. And so, but also the opportunities to work with these other artists. I mentioned David Gilmour, brilliant, brilliant guy. Eric Clapton, I worked with for 2.5 years, 2 records with John Mayer. Just been very fortunate to work with all these different artists. And that's been the joy of my career. I mean, I would be very happy and pleased if I had some level of success as a solo artist or with one artist, but to have been able to work with all these brilliant people and be a part of it, that's the crowning achievement, I guess.
Impressive. So before we ask our last question, I know that you have an incredible amount of content out there, albums, documentaries, books, everything in general, but is for people to follow you, is there a social media? Is there, what do you want people to go check out that Chuck Leavell has done?
Well, if they want to go deep, they just go to my website. It's Chuck Leavell, Leavell, chuckleavell.com. But also, if they want to learn about what we do at Charlane, Charlane, Charlane. And by the way, how did we come up with that? My proper name, the first part of my proper name, Charles, and my wife's middle name is Lane, Lane. So Charlane is what we named our land. And it's simply charlane.com that you can go there to see our activities here on the land.
Will do. We'll put that in the show notes too, so people can easily click it and take them wherever they need to go. All right. So last question. Let's say you have a magic wand and you can change any one thing about your industry. Shoot. And maybe we need to say the forestry industry and the music industry, but what would you change and why?
Oh, man. Well, the unfortunate change in the music industry was when we lost sales of physical objects that had music on them, LPs, CDs, and the world of streaming came into play. The revenues that we receive from streaming, let's say someone's going to stream a song that I wrote in the whole universe of streaming, you get something like 0.0006 cents. There's a whole formula, and that's just an example per stream. So, I kind of wish we could change the formula of how streaming works and the revenues that can be had, because, it's very, very difficult for a new band, a new artist, to come out of the chute with new material songs and make any money on the streaming business. I mean, if you're Madonna, if you're Taylor Swift, if you're Jay-Z, if you're Beyonce, you're going to have 1 billion streams and you're going to make some money. But, in the old days when we used to sell these objects called CDs and whatnot, you could make a pretty decent living as a songwriter and as an artist. So I would love to see formula of streaming changed in favor of the artist and not so much in favor of the streaming services and of the record labels that own the lion's share of the revenue. I think it would give young people, new artists, much more opportunity and comfort level. Now it's really, really important for bands and artists to depend on live performances, songs that maybe you get on a television show or on a movie, merchandise if you have a great logo. But I would like to see some relief and some revenue streams from the streaming services go to these artists. Forestry, I'm proud of what we've learned as a country, and the way, as I mentioned earlier, there was a period of time when we did rape and pillage the forests, and that was unfortunate. But there was a turnaround with these characters we mentioned earlier: Pinchot, Carl Schenck, Theodore Roosevelt, John Muir. And since that time, I think there's been a very great effort for conservation and also sustainability. And let me just finish with what does sustainability mean in terms of forestry? It means planting, managing, and growing more trees than you're going to be taking off the landscape. And therefore, we're going to always have that resource. Always, 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 perpetual. That's what we want.
Well, it was a true pleasure. You're the man, the myth, and the legend. And thank you for your time, Chuck. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, guys. All right. Wonderful to be with you. Appreciate the invitation.
All right. Take
Thanks,
care.
sir.